Okay, are we there? Everybody here? Then I suppose without further ado we can continue. Professor, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I prepared this little chart here during the break, which might help you to see the possibilities which our passage from equilibrium theory to disequilibrium theory makes possible. What I said, this is one-dimensional, this is in black and white, and we need something in three-dimension, in full color. And this is going to show how we are able to enlarge the scope of our inquiry. So instead of focusing on buying separately and selling separately and independently of one another, we combine the two. So an arbitrage is a purchase and a sell, a buy and a sell. But some kind of connection between the two. That kind of activity. And very often it's not obvious that a buy, a purchase, is really an arbitrage, because the entrepreneur or the producer compensates for the purchase by a sale somewhere else. And of course you wouldn't know what this sale is. It's his secret. Okay, it doesn't want to advertise because the competition might take advantage of that. Now, Mises and Hayek and the rest of them realized that there was such a thing. I'm not saying that they didn't realize it, but they didn't put the sufficient emphasis on the arbitrage as the main ingredient of human action. They were studying the purchase separately, the sale separately, and somehow they missed the tremendous power of combining the two. Okay. So now here it's always the price and the variation of the price in the equilibrium theory, which is, in view of our disequilibrium theory, is the wrong approach. We should always look at the spread and the variation of the spread, which is connected with arbitrage. The arbitrage is a combination of a buy and a sell. So there will be a buying price and selling price, and we are talking about the difference. And the variation of the price has a lot of what we call noise. It's a noisy channel. A lot of the variation is random variation, which does not give you any useful information. This is quite different when it comes to the variation of the spread, because it cuts out a lot of the noise. I'm not saying all the noises will be eliminated, it's too much to say, but a lot of it and therefore the information contents of the variation in the price is much smaller than the information contents of the spread. Now, again, the skill of the operator, entrepreneur or producer comes in, because this variation in the spread you have to be able to read, and one person is able to read it better than another, and the person who reads it best will have a great advantage. So that's where the producers and entrepreneurs take their clues from the variation of the spread. Far more efficient than watching the variation of the price. That's why I think watching the gold price, to my mind, is a very boring activity, regardless of how volatile. Because it's impossible to analyze every move in the gold price. However, if you look at the spread between the gold and silver price, this is a much more productive activity, and it gives you much more information if you have a trained eye to see those things which are interesting. And the same way throughout the landscape of the economy. Okay? The landscape of the economy is what I introduced in the previous lecture. There is the horizontal and there's the vertical structure of goods. And the vertical structure shows you how the semi-finished goods get matured into consumer goods. At this stage, these are all producer goods. Consumers would not buy semi-finished goods. Well, some might, because if you're tinkering or whatever. But that's the exception. In general, the consumers are not active here. These are producer goods. But they have this vertical structure. One semi-finished good matures into a definite consumer good. Okay. Now the horizontal structure, we are joining those goods according to the remoteness from the consumer, because the purpose of all production is to satisfy some consumer demand. So there are the first degree, the second, third, and so on degree good, and the degree shows the remoteness from the consumer. The smaller the degree, the closer the good is to the consumer. So that's what we refer to as the horizontal vertical structure of production. Okay. So the spread is an all-important concept. An all-important concept. And of course the most common example of a spread is the bid-ask spread of the same good. That was the first insight of Menger. There's always a pair of prices, bid price, ask price. And the rest really follows from this original observation of Menger. And then the variation of the spread is a different kind of thing altogether from the variation of the price. Much more important. I think this is something they don't really teach at universities. It's always the price and the variation of the price they are looking at. But there's a lot more information in the spread and the variation of the spread. Now we introduce the concept of a straddle. The straddle always has two legs, the long leg and the short. And the long here doesn't refer to maturity or anything like that, but it refers to buying as opposed to selling, which is the short. And I would like to emphasize that a long leg, for example, does not refer necessarily to a single good, a single item. It could be a basket of goods as well. You see? So this is very general. You don't have to think of a pile of apples is a long leg of some straddle, because it could be some apples, some oranges, some bananas or what have you, or even foodstuff, different foodstuffs, basket of goods which go into the kitchen of the restaurant to work with. Okay? That could be a long leg as well. So when you vary your long leg, there's all kinds of combinations, much more than if you just define long leg as quantity of certain item, much more wider. Also, in the long leg, the concept of the long leg, we could include other things as well, such as the wages, the wage bill. When you are talking about producing something, it's not just ingredients such as goods or basket of goods, but also services. We want to keep the concept of a long leg, but also a short leg, wide enough to cover the wage bill as well, or any kind of expense other than, the price of a good could go into the long leg. Let's think of other services than wages, about telephone bill or electricity or insurance costs. These can also go into long leg. So when you vary your long leg, it could be that you are trying to save on the phone bill or electricity, or you move from one insurance company to another because it has better services. So all these are incorporated under the concept of long leg and short leg. Long leg when you start working with a new insurance company, for instance, and short leg when you decide that you want to move your business away from that insurance company. You weren't satisfied, so you moved to another one that would go into the short leg. So, treat all this as generally as possible, almost to the breaking point when it's no longer makes sense, okay? Because the proverb says, you are mixing apples with oranges. This is quite all right here. Feel free to mix apples and oranges, but then you can think of some outrageous combination which no longer makes sense. I don't have a ready example for that, but just stretch all these concepts to the limits of extreme where they still make sense. So, okay. A straddle always has at least two legs, the short and the long leg. But sometimes we find it to our advantage to consider a straddle with more than two legs. And there are typically three of them which are worth studying. But again, I'm not saying this is strict, because you might just find three legs worth studying. In my rather simplified theory, I am concentrating on these three. So let's discuss them separately. What is a four-legged straddle, a two-legged straddle, and believe it or not, there is even a one-legged straddle. In fact, I say right away what it is. For example, the housewives moving her custom from one brand of detergent to another is a one-legged straddle. Now why? Because really there are two legs, but in order to decide whether it's a profitable or a non-profitable straddle, one leg is enough to consider. Let me explain why that is the case. Presumably, the housewife moves her custom from one brand to another because it's cheaper and just as good, the second one, as the first. But as I explained during the previous hour, the two legs are still there. They're still there. Because when you shift your custom away from one brand, that's we consider as a sale. And starting buying the other brand is the purchase, is the long leg. So it's still there, but it's enough for the one leg to look at, to decide that it's profitable because she's saving, she's buying something cheaper. Okay, so I don't have to return to that. But let me explain the four-leg straddle, which is very important. That has two long legs and two short legs. And it takes time to complete all four. And only when the last leg is put into place can you decide whether it's profitable or it turned out to be non-profitable. So you need all 4 legs, and that's why we call it 4-leg, because what happens is this. The entrepreneur is looking at the landscape of spreads. There are lots and lots of them. Because it's not just counting how many prices are, but pairs of prices, you see. So that makes the number of spreads much bigger than the number of prices. So we look at the landscape of spreads, and the entrepreneur discovers a wide spread. For example, soybean and soybean oil. And that suggests to him that there is profit to be made. Because this spread is unusually wide. By the way, is this a vertical spread or a horizontal spread? And the soybean oil. Vertical. It's vertical. So the entrepreneur or producer, as maybe, you don't have to produce soybean oil. You don't have to be a producer of soybean oil to do that, because you can go to the futures market and there is a contract for soybeans and there is another contract for soybean oil, and you can go long on the soybean oil and short on the soybean contract, and just sit back and wait until the market rectifies itself. The spread will be closed because other people will notice the unusually wide spread and they will enter the same one. But if you're a producer, then what this means is that you are going to have a wide spread, and if you produce more, if you increase your output of soybean oil, then you narrow the spread. And other producers may do the same. So as a result, the spread will narrow. Okay? So, what happens in time is this. There is an initial long leg and an initial short leg. In this case, you buy the soybean and sell the soybean oil. And then after a time, the spread closes. May not, in this case you will have a loss. But if you expect that it will narrow the spread, and it does, then at the appropriate time you will enter the opposite straddle, the closing long leg and the closing short leg. So it's easier to explain in terms of the future market. You have bought the soybean contract and sold the soybean oil contract. that was your initial long and short leg. And when the spread moved in your favor at a particular time, it's up to your judgment. Sometimes people overstay and then I'll end up with a loss. But let's just assume that the market moved in your favor, the spread narrowed, and you picked the right time to reverse and close out your long position and short position. So when you close out a long position, that's a short position, short leg. So call it the terminal short leg will cancel out your long position, and your terminal long leg will cancel out your initial short position. So these are the four legs, okay? The four legs of a four-legged straddle. And the point is, and that's why we call it four-leg, is because you don't know whether you have profit or a loss until you enter the very last leg. You just have to enter it before you can calculate your profit. And I don't think I have to give you the formula how to calculate the profit, because you can calculate your outlay with the difference of the initial spreads, the initial legs, and then you have to subtract from this the difference of the spreads when you close out your position. So that's very typical. And we can say that in the warehousing business, that is at the heart of the operation. The warehouse operator always works in terms of four-leg straddles. Now, did you ask me to give examples?
If you want to put an example with figures,
Example of what?
with some numbers.
Of this?
The four, yes.
Of this?
Yeah.
So this is the right time?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, a very typical and important application is the elevator operator, and that's not the elevator in the high-rise building, but that's the elevator where they typically store grain. When once a year the harvest comes in and the grain has to be stored, and it's over a whole year that the stockpile in the elevator, stored in the elevator, is drawn down. You see? Once a year, harvest is made, the grain is put in the elevators, and then the whole year, when during the following year, the grain is drawn down. So by next harvest, the elevator will be pretty empty again, and the next harvest will fill it up. Now, it's typical that at harvest time, the grain is cheap, right? Grain is cheap because it's plentiful. All the producers are trying to sell as much as possible. But of course, they are not desperate if they cannot. Suppose it's a bumper crop, then prices are especially cheap, you see? And the elevator operator will take advantage of this low price and buy up until he fills his elevators. But others could also store grain. And it's their collective decisions what the grain price will be. And then during the year when grain is consumed, the elevator operator or the community of the elevator operators will have the control. They could sell their stored grain faster or more slowly. You see that it's a delicate game because you are trying to hold out to be the last to sell. But it has to be before the new crop comes in. So if your estimation is correct, then you get top dollar for the last sale. If you sell out too fast, you won't get the top dollar, because the longer you wait, the better price, typically the better price you will get. However, if you overstay, then the new crop comes in, which is competitive with the old crop, and then the prices fall back again. So this is the business of the warehouse. Okay, I don't want to put numbers on that, but now the real advantage comes in when the warehouseman decides what type of grain to store. So here is an example. Let's suppose that the grain elevator operator has two bins. Let's call such a vertical thing a bin, and he has two of them. And typically he uses one bin for wheat and the other for corn. Okay? These two. But sometimes he might find it to his advantage to fill both with wheat, both with corn. So that's another parameter for him to decide whether, in what proportion he will fill the two bins. So here's an example. Normally, say, he fills one bin with corn, the other with wheat. Straightforward. But suppose that this particular year he hears that, or through some intelligence, or maybe just intuition, you speculate, that there will be a blight for the corn, resulting in much lower output. So the crop, the corn crop will be low in comparison with the wheat. Now this suggests to him that he should buy up the corn while it's still relatively cheap. Because when this knowledge about the blight becomes widespread, everybody knows that there is trouble, then they'll bid up the corn price. He wants to buy before. So he decides that he will fill both bins with corn. Doesn't bother with wheat because he expects that his profit will be so much greater if he concentrates on corn. And if indeed the blight occurs, that will be the case, you see. So this is a very delicate mechanism, and remember I started the course with the biblical story of Joseph from Genesis, and this is an example. Grain elevator operator has to be a good reader of